Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. I'm a professor of English literature at the University of Ottawa. In this video, I'm going to provide an introduction to the study of English literature. So, directed to people who may be taking a first year English literature class, whether as an English major or as an elective. So, let's get started. So, we start with any study, I think, with what is questions, and with literature, we have to say, okay, well, what is literature? And I think the first point of departure is you're studying literature. You're studying it as part of the humanities. Okay, so we can distinguish between that and other disciplines, which are studying natural sciences, social sciences, and then finally, as I said, humanities. So if we start with natural sciences, the simplest way of thinking about that is it's the study of the way of beings, the way things are as a whole. So all the things in the cosmos, their causes, their behavior. Now with social sciences, we have a study of the way of human beings, their thought and behavior, what makes them tick and move and react. And with the humanities, we have the study of the ways humans articulate meaning. So whether it's through texts, and that predominantly, I would say humanities is study of texts, but also music, musical notation, visual arts. These are ways in which hu humans have used different forms of scratching things down on paper or on cave walls or whatever the media is now to try to articulate meaning. So humanities study what it means to be human, and this need to, let's say, create a meaningful articulation of the world seems to be, for the humanist, a defining aspect of what it means to be human. So gathering the disparate phenomena of existence into a meaningful whole, an articulated whole, is that exercise of creating a meaningful articulation of the world. Other aspects of human existence, so we eat, we reproduce, we are biological entities. These we share with animals, right? So that's not a distinctive feature from the humanist perspective of what makes us human. Now, also we reason, we calculate. If reasoning, if we reduce it merely to calculation, well, a machine can do that. Increasingly, artificial intelligence can do it very well. Now, what makes, again, the human activity distinctive would be this creation of a meaningful articulation of a whole. Now, the humanities, as the study of the articulation of meaning, one of the disciplines within the humanities is literature. Okay, so literature then implies a recognition of an underlying intention or purpose or significance behind the apparently chaotic occurrences within the cosmos. So the assumption with these humanist pursuits is that there is some sort of purpose or significance underlying the chaos of the cosmos. That's not necessarily the case in every approach to phenomena, right? If the physicist might see these things as just products of statistical probabilities or randomness. So the humanist, in order to be able to articulate a meaningful articulation of the whole, has to say that there's structure and meaning there, okay, in some way. So in that point of departure, perhaps we see a bit of, let's say, the roots of what we could call a crisis of the humanities. The humanities in the last few decades have, there's been repeatedly this call that the humanities are under crisis, this question of their value proposition in today's world, question of why one would, let's say, pursue a major in the humanities, study it, why society should fund humanist endeavors. This is part of this crisis of the humanities. What is the value proposition of that pursuit? And I would say, with if we take this lens at it, it's tied to that let's say, crisis of nihilism more broadly. Now, I have a couple of videos on nihilism. So, what is nihilism, that type of thing. So, I'll put a link in the description. But basically, since the around the turn of the 20th century, you could say we've the Western world in particular has encountered this crisis of nothing having meaning, nothing having, or a denial of the sense that there is a significance, a purpose, an underlying intention to existence as a whole. Okay, so potentially those two crises are connected. Now, so we've said the humanities are the study of the articulation of meaning. Literature is a discipline within the humanities as the study of the articulation of meaning. But what is literature then, and exactly, and how does it relate to the articulation of meaning? So, most broadly, the term literature, it's we get that word from Latin, which just means writing formed with letters. So technically speaking, any written text is literature in the broadest definition. But what we study in university, we usually try to think of literature as a smaller subset, let us say, of all written material. We don't study, generally speaking, in literature classes, anything written willy-nilly. We say, okay, no, this is literature because there's something special about it. What is it about that that makes it literature as opposed to, let's say, a car manual in my example here? So most often, traditionally, there's been a sense, well, it has to be part of a creative, imaginative process, whereas the car manual in some way is not a creative, imaginative. It's a more procedural or transactional work, right? So this creative aspect of literature was identified as far back as the Greek. So the Greek word for poetry comes from poesis, which means making or creating, and was tied to this kind of imaginative, creative aspect. So to define literature, then I would hazard the following definition: a linguistic usage by which meaningful possibilities of a world are articulated for the first time. Okay. And in defining it this way, there are some echoes to the Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky, who coined this term for literature and to some extent art, generally the function of art and literature being defamiliarization. So he describes this process of taking something or an activity or a thing in the world that has become familiar to us and every day, and it almost passes by without notice. And the work of art brings it forth for the first time in a new way, and we notice it and we notice new aspects about it. So I think that's a good way of thinking about it, a good point of departure. So if we take that point of departure, we can oppose literary discourse or literary language to ordinary language and ordinary discourse. So with ordinary language, we have communication that is the exchange of already determined meanings or values. So they've already been delineated. We don't think about them too much. So an example of this ordinary language or everyday discourse might be, someone might say, I have been hurt in intimate relationships in the past, in a very kind of a very say matter of fact way. Someone might say something like that. And here, all of the terms of that sentence are taken as pre-given. They're not questioned in any way. So the speaker assumes that the audience knows what hurt means, what relationships means. Each of those terms, they're just passed like coins and not thought of. In literary discourse, one might say, love is a red, red rose. Its blossoms die early, but its thorns linger. So here, through metaphor, an aspect of love is revealed for the first time. So this metaphor, this comparison, we'll talk a bit more about metaphor later, but a metaphor bringing together two things, two images, two concepts, comparing them without using like or as, right? So the like or as, that would be a simile, right? To remember your high school days. So here in the quote, love is a red, red rose. It's not like a red, red rose. It is a red, red rose. So here the author's trying to, I think you could say that author would want the reader to bring forth an aspect of love for the first time. That it's beautiful, it's like a rose, it's beautiful, but it also is painful. Like rose, it has thorns, right? So it's natural, it grows, it has so there with that comparison, all those aspects of love, the image of love can be brought forth in a new way for the first time. Okay, so literature creates new meanings by making these kind of connections and uncovering different layers of meaning through, we could say, using language in new ways, bringing out the beauty in the world it describes, defining eternal aspects of human experience. This is an important point, and this is what makes, let's say, that when we talk about the great works of the literary tradition, they're works that have stood the test of time. They're works that people will read, and there'll be historical differences, and maybe it uses some words, some old-fashioned words that people don't understand anymore. Shakespeare, for instance, everyone's struggled with that in high school. But there's some aspect of human experience that is eternal, that's revealed there in a very, let's say, crystallizing way. Um, it's literature is directing, not simply reflecting social and human life and society. So it's directing in the sense that it makes a claim on us. It's revealing, it's challenging us to see the world in a new way and maybe inspire us to behave differently, to think differently. And in this sense, literature in its highest calling is educating, not just entertainment. So um, sometimes, well, people read, novels are still around at airports because or people are read them uh, kind of not page turner novels at a beach still. This happens because that's entertaining literature. Um, and that is one function of literature. Horace said literature should teach as well as delight. And this educating function is a key component of literature that I think what we see in the manifestation of literature as pulp fiction, as pulp literature, is an aspect that is, let's say, forgotten. So I mentioned that this metaphoric function is incredibly important. So one of the ways of making connections, articulating new meanings for experience is through comparison. So literature makes comparisons. And a key way it does that is through metaphor. So metaphor and simile. So metaphor comes from Greek metapherein. So meta is across or over or on, and pherein is carrying. So it's kind of literally carrying from one place to another. So a metaphor is carrying this image and bringing it over. So the rose over to love and saying, here, they're similar. Um, so it's a figure of speech in which one term is described in terms of another. As I mentioned, simile is one where the same comparison is happening with like or as. So an example of a metaphor, famous example from Shakespeare's As You Like It, Jake says, all the world's a stage and all the men and women are merely players. He doesn't say all the world is like a stage. He says it is a stage. And so our lives are as ephemeral, as kind of unreal, as much of a fabrication as a stage play. And I could go on that. There's a lot of implications to that metaphor because it makes us think about life in a new way. And that's what metaphors do. Uh, we have, with a comparison, we can have a metaphor. We can also have a simile. So a simile is a comparison using like as and as. And a special form of simile is this epic simile. So in the genre of epics, um, I'll put a link to my introduction to Homer in the description where I go into what is epic a bit more and epic simile a bit more. But in epics, which try to be expansive, epics try to cover uh, the greatest stories of a culture and try to be summative in a way of what is important about both the story, about that hero, the model of heroism, but also as a reflection of the cosmos and life itself. So the simile becomes expansive. So the simile is not just, love is like a rose. It's love is like those roses that grow on that hill that so many times the hero had to trudge up to, et cetera, et cetera. So you can use that simile as a way to bring forth a whole new world, and it's an amazing literary device that we find in epics. So Homer, we find it, Virgil's Aeneid, we find it in Paradise Lost by Milton, Dante's Divine Comedy. So look for those if you're reading those greatest of the great works. Here's an example from Homer's Odyssey of what I'm talking about. So this is from the episode in Homer's Odyssey where uh, Odysseus is trapped with his crew in the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus. So they've come upon a plan where they've gotten the Cyclops drunk, and now they have this large pole which they've sharpened, heated in the fire, and they're going to blind the Cyclops' soul eye as he's passed out there. So here goes the description. Straight forward they've sprinted, lifted it, and rammed it deep in his crater eye. And I leaned on it, turning it, as a shipwright turns a drill in planking, having men below to swing the two-handled strap that spins in the groove. So, with our brand, we bored the great eye socket, while blood ran out around the red-hot bar. Eyelid and lash were seared, the pierced ball hissed, broiling, and the roots popped. In a smithy, one sees a white-hot axe head or an adze, plunged and wrung in a cold tub, screeching steam, the way they make soft iron hale and hard. Just so that eyeball hissed around the spike. So we have actually two epic similes there. So the first one, and I've tried to I've tried to highlight them in blue there, the words making the epic simile. Um, and often you'll get this structure in an epic. Okay, so they're putting the pole in this Cyclops eye, and he says they were turning it just as a shipwright turns a large drill in planking, having men below to swing the strap that spins it in the groove. So they're putting this big drill or mast through holes in a ship. Um, and just as that is done by shipwrights, so too, and here's our follow-up, with our brand, we board that great eye socket. Okay, so it takes this heroic act. This is what happens often in the Homer's epic similes, is the heroic act of someone who's so legendary and should be inspiring for the reader. But we say, how when I never see Cyclops in my daily routine, how can I show that kind of heroism? But the epic simile is saying, just as you know, you're about your day-to-day business, putting something into the mast into the hole in a ship, so too we did these things. Your heroism can be compared to ours. Your heroism in going about your day-to-day tasks is in some ways, although on a lower order, you can see yourself reflected in the great deeds of an Odysseus. And then we have the second simile um, in a smithy, just as what's implied there as is just as in a smithy. So in a smith, a blacksmith takes a white hot axe head and plunges it into a cold tub, and the water hisses. Just so that eyeball hissed around the spike. So we've defined literature a little bit, as this way of bringing forth things for the first time, um, articulating new meanings, and one of the key ways through metaphor and simile. We looked at that a bit. So literature does that. But what is English literature? So English literature refers to the study of literary texts from around the world written in English. So it's a linguistic definition, not a national definition. So we study English literature, from the United States. American literature is a subfield of English literature. Canadian literature, Indian literature, Australian literature. So uh, generally speaking, literature written in English in these countries that at one time were part of the uh, the British Empire, basically, because English became that the form of speaking there. And because of that, within English studies, post-colonialism is often a mode of inquiry. So, what has happened in those countries that were former colonies, and to what extent has that relationship with the imperial power developed a certain kind of literary dialogue, so to speak, from the from the colony to the colonizer. So that's English literature written in English, linguistic definition. Sometimes there'll be, and University of Ottawa, we have a couple of courses named this British literature. Okay, so I don't think the course designers thought this through too thoroughly, but however, but when we talk about British literature, technically speaking, it's literature written in any language, um, but written in Great Britain, so that it could be written in Welsh. Okay, so it's not a linguistic definition; it's a national definition. So British literature is a slight nuance there. So English studies as a discipline, relatively recent phenomenon. Okay, as a separate discipline of study around the mid 19th century, and for the first portion of its history, largely philological in approach till World War One, where we have it tied to European nationalistic thinking for that reason. Um, and before that, I'll just point out, people didn't study English literature; they studied what could be called the great books. Is basically the liberal arts. It would be They weren't thinking of separate disciplines. A book would be part literature, be philosophy, be history, all these things blended together. So I think that presents what I would call the problem of specialization in humanistic study generally. So specialization in the natural sciences, to some extent the social sciences, an insight in a very specialized field can have ripple effects and advance the whole natural sciences. Okay. It's not as clear, it's not evident that an insight in a specialist field, a part, let's say, of the whole in the humanities advances our knowledge of the whole. So I think, in my view, if we study English literature, we always have to keep in mind that the connections to other literary languages, the the connections to history, to philosophy, to the visual arts, etc., as well as to the natural sciences and social sciences. So the future of academic literary study, just quickly, increasingly interdisciplinary. This is, I could say that for any academic discipline, actually, but English literature is no different. On the right, what we see is a sample, a detailed view of open syllabus galaxy. So open syllabus takes all these syllabi and the works that are on those syllabi, attached to what university, what discipline, and then has that huge data set, and then maps the can map them, and in this way you can slice and dice the data. It's a very cool site. Here we can see that the blue field on the right is English literature classes, but the works that are studied there, it blends into what you can see, political science in purple, the history, philosophy, all of these things. So what we do see in terms of kind of where the disciplines are going, is literary study is um, kind of increasingly blending with other humanities and social sciences, so cultural studies, women's and gender studies, critical race studies, also beginning to have some crossover with STEM and health, so evolutionary literary theory, neurohumanities, eco-criticism, health humanities. Also, I would point to somewhat new, but actually it's been happening for a couple decades, but still progressing very rapidly, especially now with AI, new advanced computational methods, quantitative methods. Kind of when I was coming through, that would have been frowned upon, quantitative approaches. Um, Now increasingly avenues for that. And I would say if one's to study literature, I think it would be profitable to have some sort of quantitative training as well. I think that although we can't lose the fact that there is a qualitative element to meaning that makes us human, that we don't want to lose that part. If we're trying to make an argument about what a work is about, a quantitative line of evidence is going to supplement those qualitative lines of evidence. So, English literary periods. I'm going to go through this quickly. So, when we uh, start to study a work, we need to ask ourselves, first off, I think, when was the work written? And this helps us to understand the dominant literary cultural movements at the time, the context of the work. So it helps us to understand where work is situates in the history of ideas in terms of the socio-political context. Um, if the literary author wants us to understand the world in a new way, it helps us to understand that against which the author is reacting. However, there are limits to periodization. Okay, so the periods that we're about to talk through, they a work cannot be reduced to its historical context. Um, in some forms of Marxism, uh, what's called reflection theory, uh, literary works, all works, were seen as merely reflections of their material conditions, their socioeconomic context. So if you lived in a Middle Ages with a feudal mode of production, then you would have certain ideas and literary forms produced just de facto. And those were just epiphenomena of those material conditions. That is reductive, to my mind and that of most scholars. Um, the other thing I would point out with the periods is that the borderlines between them are not airtight, to say the least. Okay, so when we're about to go through the periods that are roughly most often attributed to these different literary periods, but they're largely fictional. They're added by later scholars to the past, and it's not as though we're going to talk about the Renaissance starting in 1485. It's not as though authors all of a sudden woke up in 1485 and say, okay, it's the Renaissance now. I have to start writing differently, right? So, what are we looking at in this slide? So, in this slide, we're seeing, um, starting with the left, kind of pre-English roots, ancient literary works of the classical tradition. So, Homer, Aeschylus, Aristophanes, all the literary authors of the Greek tradition, but also later of the Latin tradition uh, under the Roman Republic, then Empire, Virgil, other authors, Seneca, I haven't listed here, but that tradition. So that's the most influential tradition for English literature. Um, then starting with the next column, we have medieval literature. And this covers a huge span of time, 1,000 years, from around 450 to 1485. We have works such as Beowulf, authors such as Chaucer in that huge period. And then uh, we have the Renaissance, as I mentioned, around 1485 to 1660, authors such as Spenser, Shakespeare, Milton. Now, I have detailed videos that are intros to almost all of these periods. So I have an intro to medieval literature, to Renaissance literature, Romanticism, Modernism. Um, I won't go through the four on the next four columns, but you understand you can look through and understand those yourself. Restoration, 18th century, Romanticism, Victorian literature, um, 20th century and beyond. That's a catch-all. That's the Norton Anthology of English Literature uses. But within there, most predominantly modernism and postmodernism. Now, I've color coded these because at the University of Ottawa, if you're an English major, you're going to be asked to take two courses. One course is English 2105, is British literature up to 1700. That covers those first two categories, medieval and Renaissance. And then you would take English 2106, British literature from 1700 to the present. Also listed along the bottom, the history of ideas. Again, understanding the context. What ideas are they responding to? That's an important part of understanding the period. I also have introduction videos to each of those periods, as well as kind of these three waves of modernity generally. Because the medieval period, especially, but also the Renaissance, cover uh, large, large temporal periods, it's profitable to understand a bit how they can be broken down a bit more precisely. So in the medieval period, you can have the Anglo-Saxon sub-period, Anglo-Norman, Middle English, etc. Uh, Under the Renaissance, I'll just point out that Elizabethan and Jacobean ages, so they refer to the monarchs at the time, right? So Elizabeth I was monarch in that period, and then James in that second period. So Shakespeare, this is when Shakespeare's writing. Shakespeare's writing, Spencer's writing, Sidney's writing, Marlowe, these others. So we have this rise in lyrics, so love sonnets. We have the rise of drama, sort of true tragedy for the first time in thousands of years, right? And so this is often referred to as the golden age of English literature. It's the period of literature that I specialized in. So what are the beginnings of English literature? So the island of Britain was colonized by the Romans in the 400s, but they gradually had to abandon that, or up to the 400s. They gradually had to abandon this because of other pressures in the empire. And as they did so, beginning in the mid 5th century, various Germanic tribes, as you can see represented in the map, began settling the area vacated when these Roman troops withdrew. So Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians. So the Jutes formed the Kingdom of Kent. The Saxons settled in these regions and then named them. So Wessex is from West Saxony, and Sussex from South Saxony, Essex from East Saxony. Angles formed kingdoms in Northumbria. Sort of Northumbria just refers to north of the Humber River. And East Anglia comes from the Angles. We also, from the Angles, get the term England. And the Romans had troops in Britain and coexisted with the Celtic inhabitants, but they didn't leave a linguistic impression, right? So Latin didn't become an influence on linguistic development in England. However, the Anglo-Saxons did leave a lasting linguistic imprint on the island. So modern English is basically this combination of Old Anglo-Saxon, which became Old English, which is uh, this Germanic language, combined with French. And French brought over kind of a lot of the Latin language. So combined with French, because at 1066 the Normans invaded, conquered the island and brought with them their Norman French to the language of the court. So I'll just quickly go over some of the features of these periods. So in this Anglo-Saxon literature, broadly 450 to 1066, it's oral heroic tales that are recited caesuras, so there's a pause in the middle of the line, often a heavy use of alliteration, so repetition of consonant sounds. Use of what's called kennings. So these are compound words that metaphorically describe something. So, for example, a whale road for the sea. So very interesting literary techniques. That's very ancient literary techniques of these Germanic tribes. A tension between the Germanic warrior ethos and model of heroism that these tribes brought. And then they're later Christianized. So the ethos of Christianity kind of is in tension. You can see that tension in a lot of the literature. You can see on the right some of the major works, Beowulf being the key one. I won't go through the others. So 1066, as I mentioned, we have the Norman conquest, literature written predominantly in Anglo-Norman French by writers attached to the court. So this Anglo-Norman French is basically spoken only at the court. Rise of courtly romance and chivalric tales, religious historical writings, development of Arthurian legends at this time brought from the continent, influence of feudalism and church on literary themes. So you can see some examples on the right, the owl and the nightingale, I'll point out there. So Middle English, so when it comes to medieval literature, this is the high point, around 1200 to 1485. This is where we get Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which you've probably heard of, Langland, Piers Plowman, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight we don't know the author, but Pearl Poet is often the name given to that person since the person also wrote a poem called The Pearl. We have a shift from Anglo-Norman French to Middle English as the literary language. Religious allegories and morality plays become popular, chivalric romances, and increased use of rhyme and meter in poetry. Renaissance, and here again the kind of the golden age, Renaissance literature, context being beginning in Italy, but then moving to Northern Europe, this revival of classical learning, a revival of study of Greek and Roman classics, and humanism. So going from, let's say, a medieval Christian worldview to one where the study of of human life in itself has a certain value. The other major influence, especially for English literature and other literatures in countries that went through this, is the influence of the Protestant Reformation. So English independence from Rome becomes a major theme, and you see this in Shakespeare's plays, actually. So Shakespeare has Rome in some ways figures. Cymbeline is an example. Rome as this kind of figure that needs to be the monarch of England needs to gain independence from. Influence of the printing press in spreading literature, development of sonnet blank verse, and rebirth of true drama and tragedy. So Sir Thomas More's Utopia, Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, The Fairy Queen by Spenser, Shakespeare, any work there, Hamlet, Milton, Paradise Lost, my favorite work of all time. And then the 1660, at the tail end of the Renaissance in England, there's a brief period where there's a civil war, and then for a brief period, England is a republic, they having deposed the monarchy. Then we have this restoration of the Stuart monarchy in 1660. So often, as a literary period, 1660 to the end of the 18th century are lumped together. The Restoration and 18th century is often called as one period. We have in the 18th century a rise of prose fiction and the novel so the novel is a one genre. Okay, we're going to talk about genre, but is one form of work. So Shakespeare's works are plays, they're not novels. Novels are a very particular form of prose fiction that arose in the 18th century. So a fairly recent phenomenon if you think about the thousands of years of literature. Neoclassicism, this emphasis on reason, order, and decorum in response to the Enlightenment. political and philosophical writings and the rise of satires, trying to say poke fun at, but also kind of insightful fun, like that we should be pushed to change our behavior about how we live and work as a society. So Jonathan Swift's very important there. The growth of periodicals and journalism for a broader reading public as more and more people learn how to read. So key works there, Swift, Gulliver's Travels, Robinson Crusoe by Defoe, an essay on man by Pope, and the novels by Richardson, Henry Fielding. So at the end of the 18th century and the first half of the 19th century, there's this reaction against the kind of overemphasis on rational order and decorum that we had in the 18th century. So the 18th century, this era of enlightenment and neoclassicism, had kind of emphasized this rational order and decorum and the rule of reason in human affairs. So these romantic poets, and it's not romantic in the sense of being focused on love, it's romantic in the sense of being focused on emotion and nature and individualism. Um, Gothic literature also emerges in this time, a rejection of industrialization. Key authors there, Blake, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley's Frankenstein, an example there, Lord Byron, Shelley, Keats, and a little bit of an overlap there with the periodization with Romanticism. Again, these are not sealed categories, but Victorian literature generally aligned with the rule of Victoria, Queen Victoria. We have an emphasis on realism and social critique, for instance, in the novels of Charles Dickens and Thomas Hardy, an exploration of morality and class struggles. Poetry remains influential. Tennyson, Browning are examples. However, it's in this period that the novel becomes the dominant form. And the dominant form of the novel is serialized fiction. So they would come out in installments over time. Women writers gaining a prominence. So Charlotte Bronte, George Eliot. So George Eliot's Middlemarch, maybe my favorite novel of all time. Then modernist literature. I'll remind you, as I said, for almost all of these periods, I have in the description links to detailed introductions to these, as including modernist literature. So do check out my introduction to modernist literature. Here, at the beginning of the 20th century, we have reactions to this crisis of nihilism I mentioned. So we have experimentation in narrative structure and style. Joyce and Woolf are examples. So we can't tell our stories and create meanings in the old ways, right? So we have to change and experiment with artistic forms, a rejection of those older forms, themes of alienation, fragmentation, and existential crisis in this literature, influence of World War I and technological advancements. So key works there, James Joyce's Ulysses, Eliot's To the Wasteland, two powerhouse works, and both in 1922. Kafka, as an example, not English literature, but The Sound and the Fury, Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. Virginia Woolf, my favorite 20th century author. Just I do encourage you to check out that. I have lectures on that work as well as her Mrs. Dalloway. Then in the last half of the 20th century, we have what's often called postmodernist literature, so after modernism. And we have this emphasis on a playfulness with narrative and in a style that's called metafiction. So basically, a fiction on fiction. So it's self-conscious and it's thinking about and talking about what narration does and stuff like that. So with that, you get kind of an irony, an ironic distance from the actual story that's being told, and a rejection of any grand narratives, they're called. So let's say a grand narrative around love or the importance of the family or the importance of friendship, whatever the narrative might be, or this notion of what is ultimately important. There's an ironic distance from it that makes for kind of a loss of anchor, let's say, for postmodernist literature. Some examples there, Flaubert's Parrot by Julian Barnes, another one of my favorites. Thomas Pynchon, Gravity's Rainbow, bit tougher, but I did really love his work, Crying of Lot 49. After postmodernism, so the last couple decades, some people mention that there's kind of a post-postmodernism, and I think now we're getting to silliness when it comes to these things. That novels are trying to react to the cynicism and ironic distance of postmodernism and try to seek meaning. Definitely exploration of identity and diversity is becomes more of a theme, etc. And there's some examples I put here, but I can't speak authoritatively for them, and I don't want to, partly because of the note I make on the right about the problem of canonization. So when it comes to novels written in the last, I would say the last, uh, 20 to 70 years at the very least. Um, it's very tenuously that we can say that they are great works that will stand the test of time. They haven't gone through a process of canonization. So, canonization, a canon is a set of works. So, there's a biblical canon, and canon just means it meets the measure, so to speak. Um, and a canon of great works has met this kind of bar of having stood the test of time. It speaks to eternal truths. Okay. Anything written in the last couple decades, it's too difficult for us to know if that's a great work that will stand the test of time, or is it something that merely speaks to topical tastes, okay, that are maybe a flavor of the day. So they're too close to us. There's also a problem, as I note here, around getting community consensus. Whereas before, uh, uh, there was, let's say, an academic stamp of approval that kind of those were the works that were taught by the core literary departments of different universities. And that becomes the canon because they become taught, and then their teachers, then their students go on to become profs and teach them. That ecosystem has become too diversified and distributed into other disciplines under the different politicized fields of study. The lines have been blurred. So it would be it it's going to be impossible to sift together a community consensus about what are those great works now of English literature. There's also, I would say, especially in academic study, but also in general reading, a very solid recency bias. So there's a bias to seeing these works as great and that they would stand up to Shakespeare because there's a single-minded focus on the last 100 years and on novels in terms of what people think of are the great books and what are taught. Okay, so this recency bias, just as a pet peeve of mine, I'll just mention. Like, so there's this site here called The Greatest Books, and it's an interesting site. I did check it out. It takes all these different lists of books from the internet and um, tabulates them and gives them all points and says, okay, if you put all these lists together, then the greatest book of all time, take all these different lists, would be The Great Gatsby by Fitzgerald. Good book. I don't know if it's the greatest book of all time. Where's Paradise Lost? Where's Homer? Where's Shakespeare? Where's Virgil? Okay, let's keep going. What's next? Ulysses by James Joyce. Okay, because it's on a lot of lists. Okay, that's fine. Marcel Proust. Again, these are great authors, but the greatest of all time, first of all, they're all novels. They're all novels, and they're all within the last 150 years, right? So predominantly 20th century, a couple from the 19th century. We have 2,700 years more of literature that's preserved from Homer to the present. And they're all novels. In terms of genre, there are different uh, epic. There's drama. There's philosophical works, etc. So novel of very recent form. Now, I took those, if you see the light blue, I took the top 100 from that list and I did some quantitative analysis. As I said, it's important to take my qualitative point. And I've supplemented it with a quantitative line of evidence by saying, okay, if you take the light blue that I've graphed here, these are the top 100 books. So well over 50% of them are in the 20th century and then the 19th century, and then kind of dribs and drabs from before that. So antiquity, so that's a period going from, basically the Bible, 1000 BC up to 500 of the Common Era. So at least 1500 years. There's only 5% of the works are in that period. And then Middle Ages, again, 1000 years, there's only a couple works there. All those great works that I talked about. Early modern, it would be Renaissance. That would be so Shakespeare, Milton, only 6% made the cut there. And then you've got these, this predominance of focus on the 20th century. And this maps, let's say, scholarly historical pursuits. So the darker blue is from the Canadian Historical Association's study of history dissertations in Canada. And you see how the temporal focus of those dissertations matches pretty closely to focus of the general reading public on the most recent past, the last century. So all that to say, when it comes to the recency bias, I would say the study of literature do ensure, if you're undertaking the study of literature, that you have a sense of historical depth of of the ancients, of the Middle Ages. You don't have to be an expert in them, but have a sense of that historical tradition, and not just novels of the last 50 years. So, literary genres, um, and we're near the end now. Kind of the last couple points I want to make. When you're reading a work, you ask, as I said, okay, we already talked about what is literature. So I'm picking up a book that I've determined is literature. And then I've said, okay, well, this is literature. It's going to make me think. And it's going to make me think about the world in a new way. Okay. And then I ask myself, when was it written? I wonder. Oh, yeah. So it was written in the Renaissance. So I'm going to bring in certain expectations about the historical context and maybe the author's responding to certain things. I also want to know what kind of work it is. So that's the next question I would ask myself if I'm studying literature. Um, so a kind is a genre, that's the genre, is brings with it a set of expectations and conventions. So readers bring a set of expectations, and the genre itself has a set of conventions that go with it. So convention is kind of an agreement about what's going to happen. So my example, movies have conventions. TV shows have conventions. So a Marvel movie will have a set of conventions around, well, I'm going to want a certain amount of action. I'm going to want superheroic kind of things happening. I'm going to want a villain. I'm going to want like a big fight, big boss fight at the end, that kind of thing. So there's a set of conventions there that I kind of know what's going to happen in the work. I know the types of themes that are going to be explored. It's the actual journey is going to be unique, and who's going to be the hero, and how the fight's going to be settled, and those are going to be unique, and that's what I'm waiting for. That's going to be what draws me in, is the uniqueness with which it's told. But the actual frame of the story, it's how it's going to be told. It's not going to surprise me. I know what I'm getting into, and I want those expectations to be met. So too with the genres listed here. So the biggest distinction at the top is between prose and poetry. So prose, if I were generally to define that, you could say generally unstructured language. Poetry, difficult to define what poetry is, but I would say, the safest way to describe it would be more structured language. So often using rhythm and meter, okay? Now I have a whole other lecture on sonnets that go through rhythm and meter. So iambic pentameter, what's that, etc. So I'll put a link to that. Now within poetry, we have, our oldest works are epics. So that's a form of narrative poetry. It's poetry that's longer, telling a story. There's also lyric poetry, several, and again, you can see below that many types, sonnet being one of them, or ode or elegy. And these are shorter for the most part. They less often tell a story. They're usually descriptions of a particular moment or feeling. And then there's dramatic poetry, so drama. So Shakespeare fits in this category. and different types of drama, tragedy, comedy, etc. Now, within prose, the biggest distinction is between fiction and nonfiction. Generally, in literary study, we look at fiction because the tradition has been to look at imaginative literature, creative fiction. So that's generally what's studied, but sometimes you'll also encounter essays, histories, biographies in literary study. The novel, as I mentioned, is a very recent form, invented basically in the last few hundred years, and the short story even more recently. Before that, we had kind of older legends that were written in prose. Socratic dialogues were written in prose, that type of thing, fables. Now, the last point I'll make is okay, so I know what is literature. I know I have to look at when it was written. I have to know what kind it is. And then I have to think a bit about what I'm doing when I'm reading this work. How do I interpret the work? And this is what literary theory is. So as I mentioned, my specialty is Renaissance literature. My other specialty is literary theory. Now, this is a complex field, and I'm going to produce a whole other set of videos, a course on contemporary literary theory. But this side provides kind of an overview of key directions of literary theory. So literary theory is this mode of studying different ways of thinking about how to interpret texts, okay? So the simplest way that I can think about it is you have an author, a text, and a reader, and an author has a world or horizon that they're writing within, and the reader has their own horizon and world, etc. And each one of those, or the horizons, or the fusion of the horizons, can be the focus of the interpretation, okay? And each one has term here. Some of these terms I've taken from M.H. Abrams, others have come from other theorists, but you can think of a mimetic approach where the text is a mimesis, a representation of the world, is telling us something about the world, expressive. And this comes with the Romantics in the beginning of the 19th century. The text is telling us something about the author's unique vision of the world. It's not about the world, it's about the author's unique vision. So I think there's still imprints of that expressive view of art with us. There's the objective approach, and this with the new critics at the beginning of the 20th century. So they're not that new; they're about 100 years old now. But at the time, they were called new critics who wanted us to just look at the text. So when I've been saying to look at the historical context as one of the things you think about, they were saying, no, 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 just look at the text and don't think about anything outside. So let's just look at it as a separate, distinct object. Historicism is an approach that tries to situate the text in historical conditions and really ground that as the meaning. And Marxist interpretation is a variety of historicism. It can be reductive, as I mentioned, but there is a certain value to understanding historical context. Reader response wants to look at how does the reader react to the text? That's a poll of interpretation. And the goal is to say, okay, well, let's look at that interaction. And then hermeneutics is particularly of Gadamer, is way of saying, okay, well, the author has their world, and a lot of that world is external to me, and I can't really relate to it. And there's my world, and through the interaction of reading, it's this fusion of horizons, and there's going to be a dialogue within that. So I invite you to, as you undertake literary study, think about uh, studying literary theories in more depth. And as I said, I'll be developing an extensive course on that. Think about trying to carve out for your own way of approaching texts, your own preferred, let's say, set of methods. And but for the time being, that doesn't prevent you from reading the great works. As I said, I have introductory videos here. Uh, I have videos on Homer, Milton, Aeneid, if you want to start with epics and kind of some of our oldest literature, as well as to those other periods that we've talked about. Start with those works, try to learn a bit about the context, try to make sure you understand the genre. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to English literature. If you have any comments, leave them in the comment section of works you'd like to explore in more depth, or if you have any comments about the content here. If you do like this content, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel. That helps others find it. Thank you very much.